He thought excluding her from the leadership retreat would quietly erase her from the future of the company. But he had no idea he had just set the stage for his own undoing. The conference room on the 32nd floor overlooked a skyline of glass and steel, sunlight reflecting off neighboring towers like silent witnesses to decisions that shaped careers and destroyed them just as quickly. And at the center of it all stood Richard Lawson, senior executive, tailored navy suit, voice calm and controlled as he finalized the guest list for the annual leadership retreat, an invitation-only event held at a private resort in Aspen, Colorado, where the company's most powerful minds gathered to decide what the next 5 years would look like. And to everyone else in that room, it was more than a retreat. It was a signal of who mattered and who didn't. And when Richard's assistant handed him the final roster, his eyes scanned the names with practiced efficiency. Before stopping briefly on one entry, Emily Carter, he paused for less than a second, just long enough to make a decision that would ripple further than he intended. Then, with a small, almost dismissive motion of his pen, he drew a clean line through her name. "She's not leadership material," he said, not looking up, his tone casual, final, as if stating an obvious fact no one would question, and no one did. Because in rooms like this, silence wasn't agreement, it was survival. And across the office floor below, Emily Carter sat at her desk near the far end of the open workspace, where the hum of printers and the low murmur of conversations blended into a background she had learned to disappear into, her blouse simple, her posture straight, her movements efficient, the kind of employee people relied on but rarely noticed. The kind who stayed late, who fixed problems quietly before they became visible. The kind who didn't interrupt meetings or speak unless she was certain her words carried weight. And that morning, she had submitted a strategic proposal, a detailed breakdown of market expansion opportunities that most executives hadn't even begun to consider. But when her manager passed by her desk with a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, she already knew. "They've finalized the retreat list," he said, placing a thin folder beside her keyboard. "It's a tight group this year." The words were careful, rehearsed, and Emily nodded before even opening it, because she understood what wasn't being said. And when she finally looked down at the list, her name wasn't there. Just a clean absence where it should have been, no explanation, no discussion, just omission, and around her, the office carried on, a few colleagues exchanging glances, one whispering something just low enough to avoid being heard clearly, another offering a sympathetic shrug that felt more like distance than support, and Emily didn't react, not outwardly, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper, her expression unchanged, but something shifted behind her eyes, something quiet and deliberate, as if a door had closed and another had opened somewhere deeper. And in the glass reflection of her monitor, she caught a glimpse of herself, not the version they saw, not the quiet employee in the corner, but something steadier, something far less fragile than they had assumed. And for a moment, the noise of the office seemed to fade, replaced by a stillness that settled over her like clarity, because exclusion, she understood, was rarely the end of a story. Sometimes it was the beginning of one no one saw coming. And across the building, high above where she sat, Richard Lawson signed off on the final arrangements, already moving on to the next decision, unaware that the name he had crossed out so easily was the one he would soon be forced to remember, not as an oversight, but as the turning point he never saw coming. The rest of the office moved on as if nothing had happened, but quiet exclusions have a way of echoing louder than open rejection. And Emily Carter felt that echo settle into the space around her like a presence no one else acknowledged. Her computer screen glowing softly as she reopened the proposal she had submitted that morning, the same document that had taken her 3 weeks of late nights and early mornings to complete, every line carefully built, every projection backed by data most people in the company had not even thought to examine. And yet it had been dismissed without discussion, without even a question, as if the value of the work was tied not to its accuracy, but to the person who delivered it. And across the floor, clusters of employees gathered in low conversations, some excitedly discussing Aspen, mentioning private lodges, strategy sessions by stone fireplaces, networking opportunities that would quietly shape promotions for the next fiscal year, while others spoke in more measured tones, aware enough to keep their voices down but not enough to stop entirely, and Emily caught fragments as they drifted through the air. "They only take the top performers," someone said, followed by a softer reply, "or the ones they think look like leaders." And there was a brief pause before a quiet laugh that was quickly disguised as a cough. And Emily did not turn around, she did not acknowledge it, because she had learned long ago that reacting too soon only confirmed the assumptions people already held about you. Instead, she adjusted the alignment of a column on her spreadsheet with steady hands, her movements precise, controlled as if nothing had shifted at all, but inside, something was recalibrating, not breaking, not shrinking, but narrowing into focus, like a lens tightening on a single point of clarity. And at 11:45, her manager stopped by again, lingering just long enough to create the appearance of support without the risk of involvement. "It is not personal," he said, lowering his voice slightly, though no one had asked him to. "They are looking for a certain presence." He added, searching for the right word as if the explanation itself required careful packaging, and Emily nodded once, her expression calm, "Of course." She replied, her voice even, offering him exactly what he needed, agreement without resistance, because she understood something he did not, that power often revealed itself not in how decisions were made, but in how they were accepted. And as he walked away, relieved to have completed what he considered a difficult conversation, Emily's eyes returned to her screen. But this time she was not reviewing her proposal, she was studying it, analyzing where it could go further, where the model could expand beyond what she had already presented. Because if there was one thing she knew with certainty, it was that truth did not depend on invitation, and capability did not require recognition to exist. And as the afternoon stretched on, the sunlight shifting across the office floor in slow, deliberate lines, Emily opened a new document, the blank page reflecting back at her like an unspoken challenge. And for a moment, she simply stared at it, her reflection faint in the glass of her monitor, steady eyes, composed posture. A presence so easily overlooked by those who mistook quiet for absence. And then, without hesitation, she began to type, each keystroke deliberate, each sentence sharper than the last, not written for approval, not written for permission, but written because she knew something the rest of them did not yet understand. That exclusion does not eliminate value. It isolates it, concentrates it. And when the moment comes, it does not return quietly. It arrives with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt, and somewhere far above. Preparations for the retreat continued without interruption. Names finalized, schedules confirmed, confident voices filling rooms where decisions were made quickly and without hesitation. Completely unaware that the one voice they had chosen to ignore was already preparing to be the one they could not ignore for much longer. By the time the sun dipped behind the skyline, the decision to exclude her had already begun to ripple in ways no one upstairs could see. And Emily Carter was no longer working to be included. She was working to be undeniable, the glow from her desk lamp casting a soft circle of light as the rest of the office gradually emptied. Chairs pushed in, monitors going dark one by one, the quiet settling in like a curtain falling on a stage where only she remained. And in that silence, her focus sharpened, her fingers moving steadily across the keyboard as data transformed into strategy. Projections refined into something stronger, something cleaner, something impossible to ignore, because what she had written earlier was not wrong, it was simply incomplete, not because she lacked insight, but because she had held back, shaped her ideas to fit what she believed they were willing to hear. And now, with nothing left to prove to them, she stopped editing herself. The numbers shifting under her guidance, models expanding, connections forming that had been invisible before, and hours passed without her noticing. The clock in the corner of her screen ticking past 6, then 7, then 8, until the building itself seemed to breathe differently, quieter, slower, as if acknowledging that what was happening in that corner of the floor mattered more than the noise that had filled it earlier. And somewhere across the country, in a luxury resort surrounded by snow-covered mountains, the first evening of the leadership retreat unfolded exactly as planned: warm lighting, polished wood interiors, executives gathered around long tables discussing growth targets and market positioning, confident voices filling the room, each one certain they were shaping the future of the company. Richard Lawson seated at the head, reviewing the same metrics Emily had studied hours earlier, but without the depth she had uncovered, without the patterns she had seen. And when one of the directors presented a strategy for expansion into a new regional market, there was a subtle hesitation in the room, something not quite aligning. Projections that looked promising on the surface, but carried an underlying instability no one could fully articulate. And Richard leaned back slightly, his expression tightening for just a moment, because even he could sense it, the quiet inconsistency, the missing piece. But instead of addressing it, the conversation moved on, redirected, smoothed over by confidence and authority. Because in rooms like that, doubt was often treated as weakness. And back in the city, Emily reached a point where everything clicked, the model on her screen aligning with a precision that felt almost inevitable. Her eyes scanning the final output, verifying each assumption, each calculation not once but twice, until there was no uncertainty left. And she sat back for the first time in hours, the faint reflection of her face visible against the darkened office windows, calm, steady, certain, because this was no longer a proposal. It was a solution, not a suggestion, but an answer to a problem they had not yet realized they were facing. And without hesitation, she compiled the document, concise, direct, stripped of anything unnecessary, the kind of work that did not ask for attention but commanded it. And as her cursor hovered over the send button, addressed not to her manager, not to a single department, but to the executive distribution list that included every name currently gathered in that retreat, she paused for only a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because she understood exactly what would happen next. And then she clicked send. And somewhere in a room filled with confident voices and carefully managed certainty, a notification would appear, quiet, almost insignificant, the kind most people ignored. Except this one carried something different, something that would not stay unnoticed for long. And in that moment, the balance began to shift, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more powerful: clarity. The notification appeared quietly on the screen, almost insignificant among the stream of messages that flowed through the retreat's internal system. But something about the subject line made one of the directors pause, his hand hovering over the trackpad before clicking it open. And within seconds, his posture changed, the casual lean in his chair straightening into something more attentive. "Richard," he said, not loudly, but with enough weight to shift the room's attention. "You might want to see this." And conversations slowed, then stopped, the low hum of confidence dissolving into a cautious silence as the document began circulating across screens, one by one, each executive reading, each expression subtly shifting from curiosity to focus, from focus to something more unsettled. Because what they were looking at was not just another internal proposal, it was precise, structured with a clarity that cut through assumptions they had not even realized they were making. Projections recalibrated with a level of accuracy that exposed the weakness in the strategy they had just been discussing minutes earlier. And Richard Lawson leaned forward, his eyes scanning the first page, then the next, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he reached the section where the model diverged from their current plan, not dramatically, but decisively, like a quiet correction that left no room for argument. And for a moment, no one spoke, the room holding its breath as if waiting for someone to challenge it, to dismiss it, to regain control of the narrative. But no one did, because every number held, every assumption aligned, every conclusion followed with a logic that could not be easily undone. And finally, one of the senior partners broke the silence, "This contradicts everything we have been building toward," he said slowly, not with frustration, but with recognition, and another voice followed, quieter, more measured. "No, it refines it." And that was when the shift became undeniable, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, like a current changing direction beneath the surface. And Richard scrolled to the top of the document, searching for the name, expecting perhaps an external consultant, a specialist brought in without his awareness, someone with credentials that justified this level of insight. But when he saw it, he stopped, his hand freezing for just a fraction of a second before continuing as if nothing had happened. But the moment had already passed through him, registered in a way he could not ignore: Emily Carter. The name sat there without emphasis, without title beyond her position. Simple, unadorned, and yet suddenly impossible to overlook. And across the table, another executive spoke. "Who is this?" The question cutting through the room with a directness that left no room for deflection. And Richard leaned back slightly, his expression composed. But the answer did not come immediately, not because he did not know, but because he now understood what that knowledge meant. "She is on the strategy team," he said finally, his tone controlled, neutral, as if the information carried no weight. But the silence that followed suggested otherwise, because in that moment, every person in that room realized something at the same time: that the one voice not present among them had just become the most relevant one. And thousands of miles away, in a quiet office where the lights had dimmed and the city outside had settled into the rhythm of the night, Emily Carter closed her laptop with the same calm precision she had carried throughout the evening, not checking for a response, not waiting for acknowledgement, because she did not need to see their reaction to understand it. She had already seen the outcome in the structure of her work. And as she gathered her things and stepped into the empty hallway, the faint echo of her footsteps against the polished floor seemed to carry a different weight now, not louder, not heavier, but clearer, as if each step marked the distance between who they believed she was and who she had just shown herself to be. And back in that room filled with authority and certainty, Richard Lawson stared at the document one more time, the numbers unchanged, the conclusions unshaken. And for the first time that evening, the confidence that had filled the room at the start began to feel less like control and more like something fragile, something that had just been quietly, precisely, and completely rewritten. The silence in the room did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, uneasily, like a structure adjusting under unexpected pressure. And the confidence that had filled the space only an hour earlier now felt thinner, more fragile, as if everyone present understood that something fundamental had just changed. And Richard Lawson knew it too, though he did not show it, his expression composed, controlled, his posture unchanged as he closed the document and rested his hands lightly on the table, a gesture that signaled authority even as the ground beneath that authority had begun to move. "We need to verify these assumptions," he said finally, his voice steady, measured, reclaiming the room with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being followed. But the words did not carry the same weight they had before, because doubt had already entered, and once it did not leave easily. One of the directors leaned forward, tapping the edge of his tablet. "I already checked the data sources," he replied, his tone not confrontational but firm. "They are accurate." And another voice followed, quieter, more analytical. "The model explains the inconsistencies we could not resolve earlier." And just like that, the conversation shifted away from defense and toward recognition, not of a mistake, but of a correction. And Richard felt it, the subtle transfer of momentum. The room no longer waiting for his direction, but moving toward something he had not initiated. And for the first time that evening, he was not leading the discussion. He was catching up to it, and across the table, a senior partner looked up, his expression thoughtful. Why was she not included here? The question was simple, direct, but it landed with a weight that filled the space immediately, and no one spoke for a moment, because the answer was not complicated, it was uncomfortable, and Richard's jaw tightened slightly, just enough to register the shift, but not enough to reveal it fully. Selection was based on leadership criteria. He said, each word deliberate, carefully chosen, but even as he spoke them, he knew they no longer held the certainty they once did. Because the evidence sitting in front of them contradicted the assumption behind those criteria. And the room felt it, that quiet contradiction hanging in the air, undeniable. And one of the younger executives, someone who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. If this is the level of insight she brings, then the criteria might need to be reconsidered. And there it was, not a challenge, not an accusation, but a statement that shifted the balance further. And Richard did not respond immediately. Because in that moment, responding would not restore control, it would only expose the gap between perception and reality. And instead, he nodded once, a small acknowledgement that allowed the conversation to move forward without admitting fault. "We will review it," he said, but the words felt different now, less like a decision and more like a necessity. And as the discussion continued, evolving around the framework Emily had introduced, refining it, expanding it, building upon it in real time, it became clear to everyone in that room that the direction of the company's strategy had already changed, not because they had decided to change it, but because it had been presented to them in a way that left no alternative. And miles away, Emily Carter stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights stretching out in every direction, steady, constant, indifferent to the decisions made inside glass towers. And she paused for a moment, not to reflect on what had happened, but to acknowledge something quieter, something more certain, that the moment had passed from being ignored to being recognized, and she did not need confirmation to know it. Because recognition was never about applause, it was about alignment. And somewhere in a room filled with authority, people were now aligning themselves with something she had created, something they could not dismiss. And back at the retreat, Richard Lawson sat still for just a moment longer than usual, the conversation continuing around him, his name no longer the center of it, his authority no longer unquestioned. And for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about the next move. He was thinking about the one he had already made, the simple line he had drawn through a name, a decision so small it had seemed insignificant at the time, and now impossible to ignore. And in that realization, something settled in the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that could not be undone, that leadership was not determined by invitation. And exclusion did not erase value. It revealed who understood it and who did not. By the next morning, the air inside the retreat had changed in a way no one could openly acknowledge, but everyone could feel, the conversations quieter, more deliberate, as if each word now carried the weight of being measured against something unseen but undeniable. And Richard Lawson stood near the large windows overlooking the snow-covered landscape, a cup of untouched coffee in his hand, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, steady on the outside, but behind that composure, calculations were shifting, because the document Emily Carter had sent was no longer just part of the discussion, it had become the center of it, every breakout session referencing it, every projection adjusted by it, and what had started as a quiet interruption had now become the framework no one could ignore. And as he turned back toward the room, he saw it clearly, the way others were engaging, the way their attention moved not toward authority, but toward accuracy, and in that subtle shift, he recognized something that experience had taught him never to underestimate. Influence had changed hands, not through position, not through title, but through clarity, and across the table. One of the senior partners was already outlining next steps based on Emily's model, assigning tasks, redefining timelines, restructuring priorities as if the plan had always been theirs, and no one questioned it, because it worked, and in rooms like this, what worked became truth faster than anything else. And finally, Richard spoke not to reclaim control, but because silence would now reveal more than words, set up a call. He said, his voice calm, direct, and the room paused just for a moment, as if acknowledging the significance of what he was asking, with Emily Carter. He added, the name spoken now not as an afterthought, but but as a necessity, and there was no hesitation in the response, no resistance, only a quiet nod as someone reached for their phone. Because at this point, the decision was no longer optional. It was inevitable, and miles away, in the same office that had been nearly empty the night before, Emily walked in at 8:15. The early morning light casting long shadows across the floor, her steps measured, unhurried, as if nothing about her routine had changed. And in many ways, it had not. She placed her bag down, turned on her computer, and began reviewing the overnight data updates as she always did, her focus steady, her posture composed. But before she could fully settle into the rhythm of the morning, her phone vibrated softly against the desk. The sound small, almost insignificant, but in the quiet of the early hour, it carried clearly. And when she glanced at the screen, she saw the incoming request. A scheduled call, direct, immediate, from the leadership retreat, and for a brief moment, she simply looked at it, not with surprise, not with anticipation, but with a kind of quiet recognition. As if confirming something she had already known would happen, and around her, the office had not yet filled, the usual noise still absent, giving the moment a stillness that felt almost deliberate, and she reached out, her hands steady, and accepted the call without hesitation, because this was not a reaction, it was a continuation. And back in that room surrounded by polished wood and controlled expectations, the screen at the front of the table flickered to life. The connection establishing, and one by one, the executives turned their attention toward it, their posture shifting slightly, their expressions more focused, more attentive than they had been the day before. And when Emily Carter appeared on the screen, seated at her desk, simple, composed, exactly as she had always been, there was a brief moment where no one spoke, not out of uncertainty, but out of adjustment, because the person they had not considered was now the one they needed to hear from, and in that quiet, something settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that could not be undone. That presence was not defined by where you sat, but by what you brought to the table. And in that moment, Emily had already taken her place. No one expected her voice to carry that kind of weight, not in that room, not through that screen. And yet the moment Emily Carter began to speak, the space shifted in a way that could not be undone. Her tone calm, measured, not loud, not forceful, but precise, every word placed exactly where it needed to be, as if she had already walked through the conversation before it even began. And for a brief moment, no one interrupted, not out of politeness, but because there was nothing to interrupt. She did not pause to seek approval. She did not soften her analysis to make it more comfortable. She simply laid it out, the flaw in the existing strategy, the inefficiency hidden inside their projections, the opportunity they had overlooked because they had been looking in the wrong direction. And as she spoke, the executives followed, not leading, not guiding, but listening, truly listening, their attention anchored to the clarity she brought into the room. And Richard Lawson remained still, his expression controlled, but his focus fixed entirely on her. Because this was no longer about whether she was capable, that question had already been answered. This was about understanding how he had missed it. And as Emily moved through the final section of her explanation, outlining the path forward with a confidence that did not need reinforcement, she concluded without hesitation, without flourish, simply stating what needed to be done. And then she stopped, not filling the silence, not rushing to justify, just allowing the space to settle, and for a moment, the room held that silence, not empty, but full, charged with the recognition of something undeniable. And then one of the senior partners leaned forward slightly. "This changes our timeline," he said, not questioning but acknowledging, and another voice followed. "It also reduces our risk exposure significantly." And just like that, the discussion resumed, but this time it was different, not centered around hierarchy, not guided by position, but built around substance, around what worked, around what held under scrutiny. And Emily remained on the screen, steady, present, but not dominating. She answered when asked, clarified when needed, and otherwise allowed the work to speak for itself. Because she understood something the others were only beginning to realize. That authority given can be questioned, but authority earned through clarity cannot. And across the table, Richard finally spoke, his voice even measured, but carrying a weight that was different from before, less performative, more deliberate. Why was this not presented earlier? He asked, the question directed at her, but the answer reaching further than the words themselves, and Emily met it without hesitation, her gaze steady, her tone unchanged. It was, she said simply, not defensive, not sharp, just factual, and the room went completely still. The kind of stillness that does not come from confusion, but from recognition, and no one needed clarification, no one needed elaboration, because the meaning was clear. The moment landed not as an accusation, but as a truth that had been overlooked, and Richard did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to correct, only something to accept. And in that quiet, something shifted once more, not in the structure of the conversation, but in the perception of the person at the center of it, because Emily Carter was no longer the quiet presence at the edge of the room. She was now the point everything moved around, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. And as the call continued, decisions being made, directions set, priorities realigned, one thing became increasingly clear to everyone involved, that the person they had once considered unnecessary had just become indispensable. And somewhere in that realization, the final layer of assumption fell away, leaving behind something far more difficult to ignore: the undeniable weight of truth presented without noise, without force, and without permission. The call ended without applause, without dramatic reactions, just a quiet understanding that something irreversible had taken place. And as the screen went dark, the room did not immediately move, no one rushing to speak, no one eager to reclaim the space with confident voices, because what had just happened did not leave room for noise, it demanded reflection. And Richard Lawson remained seated, his gaze fixed on the blank screen for a moment longer than necessary, as if expecting something else to appear, some detail he might have missed, but there was nothing left to reinterpret. The clarity Emily Carter had delivered left no gaps, no ambiguity, and across the table, the others began to shift, not back into their previous rhythm, but into something more grounded, more careful. Their conversations quieter now, more precise, as if each word carried a responsibility it had not carried before, and one of the senior partners finally broke the silence. Not with authority, but with acknowledgement. "We adjust immediately," he said, and there was no disagreement, no hesitation, because the direction was no longer a matter of opinion. It had already been decided by the strength of the insight they had just received. And Richard nodded once. A subtle motion, but one that signaled alignment rather than command, because in that moment, leading meant recognizing, not controlling. And as the session resumed, the agenda shifted completely. What had been planned over weeks now rewritten in a matter of minutes. Strategies restructured, timelines recalibrated, responsibilities reassigned, all built around the framework Emily had introduced, and no one questioned it, because questioning would mean denying something they had already accepted as true. And miles away, the office had filled with its usual morning energy, conversations starting, keyboards clicking, coffee cups placed on desks as routines resumed, and Emily Carter sat exactly where she had always sat. Her posture the same, her focus steady, reviewing updates, responding to emails, her presence unchanged in appearance but not in perception, because word had begun to move, quietly at first, a mention here, a glance there. A shift in tone when her name was spoken, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable, and her manager approached her desk again, this time without the rehearsed calm from the day before, his expression different, more attentive, more cautious, as if recalibrating his understanding in real time. "They are restructuring the strategy," he said, his voice lower, more measured, "based on your model." And Emily nodded once, not surprised, not seeking validation, just acknowledging the information as part of a process already in motion. And as he lingered for a moment, searching for something more to say, something that might bridge the distance between yesterday and now, she simply returned her attention to her screen, not dismissing him, but not adjusting her focus either, because she understood that recognition did not require performance, it required consistency. And across the country, the retreat continued. But it was no longer the same event, no longer a gathering defined by hierarchy, but one shaped by something far more difficult to control, truth that had revealed itself without invitation. And Richard Lawson stood once more at the head of the room. But this time, his presence carried a different weight, not diminished, but refined, because leadership, he realized, was not about deciding who belonged. It was about recognizing who already did. And as he looked around the room, now aligned around a direction they had not originally chosen, he understood something that had been easy to overlook before, that authority can exclude, but it cannot define value. And in that realization, the final layer of certainty gave way to something more grounded, something that did not rely on perception or position, but on what remained when both were stripped away, and somewhere far from that room, at a desk that had once been considered ordinary, Emily Carter continued her work, not elevated by recognition, not changed by attention, but exactly as she had always been, precise, consistent, and impossible to ignore once seen clearly. By the time the retreat concluded, no one needed to say it out loud. The outcome had already been written in the quiet shifts that followed Emily Carter's voice, in the decisions that no longer followed old assumptions, in the subtle recalibration of who was seen and who was no longer overlooked. And as the executives prepared to leave, gathering their materials, exchanging measured conversations about implementation and next steps, there was a different kind of awareness in the room. Not dramatic, not emotional, but grounded, the kind that comes when something fundamental has been revealed and cannot be unseen. And Richard Lawson lingered behind for a moment, standing near the long table where the final strategy now rested. A plan that had begun without her and ended because of her. His hand resting lightly on the edge as he looked down at the documents, not searching for flaws, not questioning their direction, but recognizing the clarity they carried. And for the first time in a long time, his thoughts were not about control or authority, but about precision, about what it meant to truly see value without filtering it through expectation. And he understood then that leadership was not about deciding who fit into the room. It was about making sure the room could recognize the people who already belonged in it. And back at the office, the day unfolded like any other on the surface. Meetings scheduled, deadlines moving forward, conversations continuing. But underneath, something had shifted permanently. Emily Carter was no longer just another name in the system. She was now a reference point, her work cited, her insights sought, not with fanfare, not with sudden praise, but with a steady acknowledgement that carried more weight than recognition ever could. And when a new strategy meeting was announced later that afternoon, her name appeared on the list without explanation, without ceremony, simply present, exactly where it should have been all along. And as she walked into the conference room, the atmosphere felt different, not because she had changed, but because the room had. Conversations paused briefly, eyes lifting, not in surprise but in quiet respect, the kind that does not demand attention but gives it. And Emily took her seat without hesitation, placing her notes on the table, her posture calm, her focus steady. The same as it had always been, because for her, nothing about the work had changed, only the perception around it had caught up. And across the table, Richard Lawson met her gaze for a brief moment, not with dominance, not with dismissal, but with something closer to recognition, a silent acknowledgement of what had already been proven. And then the meeting began, not as a correction of the past, but as a continuation shaped by it, ideas exchanged more carefully, questions asked with intention, decisions made with a clarity that had not been there before. And as the discussion moved forward, one thing became clear to everyone in that room: that value does not announce itself. It reveals itself through consistency, through precision, through the quiet confidence of knowing exactly what you bring. And as the meeting concluded, there was no dramatic ending, no grand statement to mark the shift that had taken place, just a steady progression into what came next. Because the lesson had already been delivered, not through words, but through action. And as Emily gathered her things and stepped out into the hallway, the same hallway she had walked through countless times before, it no longer felt like a place she needed to prove herself in, but a place that had finally learned to see her clearly. And somewhere in that quiet understanding, the story resolved itself without needing to be spoken. That respect is not granted by invitation. It is earned through clarity. And once revealed, it does not ask for permission to remain.